Okay, so welcome back. This week we're talking about the expanded rhetorical situation. So that is the rest of your terms here on this term sheet. Last week we covered communicator, audience, and message. So this week we're covering purpose through circulation. So go ahead and make sure you have your term sheet pulled up through this video lecture. So that you're taking notes. You can use your textbook too, all the reading you did there. But I want to see good notes on each of these terms. Make sure that you understand them. Now, let me pull this up and get going. Once again, I've rearranged just a little bit. Well, not a little bit. Maybe present things just slightly differently than your textbook. So your textbook starts off talking about context. And you'll see, yeah, from the image here, really all of the rhetorical situation is about context, about the idea of context. But I'm going to start by talking about purpose, just because purpose is so closely related, in my opinion, to message, which we talked about last week. So we're going to start with purpose, then we'll pull back and talk about context, and then we'll move into all of the other terms. So starting here with purpose. I mentioned in last week's lecture video that many consider purpose to be part of that base rhetorical situation, or they'll use the term purpose instead of the term message. And so sometimes the term purpose and message, they can be used interchangeably, but there is a slight difference between them as well. Purpose is often talked about in terms of broad categories. Your book lists 4 of them: to persuade, to inform, the aesthetic and literary purposes, and scholarly inquiry purposes. But like I mentioned in your quiz, if you've already taken the reading quiz, maybe in school you've learned about the purpose pie, author's purpose pie. This is just how I learned about it. The 3 great purposes are to persuade, to inform, and to entertain. The only reason I put that here is if you're familiar with that, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about sort of these broad general categories of purpose. But like your textbook's message mentions, it's not just these 3. It's not just persuasion or informing or entertaining. There are multiple types of purposes, right? And there are also varying levels of purposes. It can be everything from that wide, my goal is to persuade, to the more specific, my goal is to persuade you to buy something, to the even more specific, my goal is to get you to buy this particular product, right? So there's layers of purpose, and then all the way down to the very specific message of the text we're looking at. So if you remember the Nike ad that we talked about, all those layers of message and purpose, part of the purpose was to inspire you from that Nike ad. Another purpose was to get you to feel brand loyalty to Nike. And then, of course, the overall purpose is to get you to actually pay money to buy Nike products. So, right, levels of purposes that are mixed up in the message. All right, I hope that makes sense. That purpose and message are sort of similar, but also a little bit distinct sometimes and have varying overlapping layers. Okay, now let's talk about this idea of context, because context is important. And what we mean by the term context, honestly, I feel like context is just another term for the rhetorical situation in general. The whole rhetorical situation is talking about the context. Remember how I defined the rhetorical situation as everything outside of a text? That's what context is. Context, outside of the text, things that are framing the text, right? But again, there are specific categories of context. The ones we'll talk about, the ones your book mentions, but categories of context that are important to consider to frame a rhetorical text, frame a rhetorical piece. So your book talks about, what we have right here is citational context. So this one's interesting because it's usually maybe only just for print stuff, but we can most definitely find ways to apply it to other text. But it's like if you're looking at an ad and you're analyzing an ad, which we will be doing in our next unit, you ask questions like, where was this ad published? Was it in a magazine? Was it in a newspaper? Why that specific magazine? So this is my stack of magazines here. Why that specific, or why next to this article, or think about a television commercial, right? When do they run a television commercial? Now, I know that we are living in the age of streaming TV, and so you guys all grew up with Netflix and are far less familiar with what commercial context is what we'll call it. But when I was growing up, and all we had was cable television, there was very different kinds of commercials that aired in the daytime. Um, and so like in the middle of the day, and those were commercials like prescription medications, or hearing aids, or community college, or trade school, or come be a trucker for us. And those commercials were airing in the middle of the day because they were targeting people who were home, not working, not part of the active workforce, who were possibly elderly or out of work, because those are the types of people at home during the day. Um, and it was a very different type of commercial that aired at night during primetime television when everyone was home to watch TV. So that's sort of a citational context. What shows were commercials aired during? I mean, everyone knows Super Bowl ads, right? That's a citational context. This ad aired in the middle of the Super Bowl, right? Something to know about the text and to give it some context. Okay, briefly, another category is geographical context. Um, so, uh, is this a local issue? Is this text meant for a very localized small community? Um, is it a global text meant for a global audience? Country? I mean, like geographical context can cover any sort of locational issue. Um, Okay, then we have historical context. So I went ahead and put down the Declaration of Independence because I personally think this one's a super interesting historical context. Anyway, an obvious historical context. Um, yes, when in history is this happening, and what's going on in history? Um, and it doesn't even have to be like centuries ago. It can be recent history. Um, and you think of in terms of what was happening in history to influence the production of that text. And then social cultural context. And this one is about considering things like politics or cultural or social values in a given time and place, or sort of like public feelings or what's going on in the culture at that moment of production. All right, so I hope that helps context make sense. And so when you're thinking about your your essays, and you're writing about your genre of self-presentation, whatever text or objects it is you're using to talk about in your essay, consider these contextual issues, right? Historical, citational, geographical, social, cultural, all of those things. See how you can think about context in view of your essay. All right, let's talk about exigence. Um, because I'm willing to bet that most of you, if not all of you, have probably never heard this term before. But this one is actually my favorite rhetorical term to talk about because I think it's one of the most interesting things to think about when it comes to analyzing rhetoric. So, your book defines exigence as whatever prompted a rhetorical action, which is that's a very fair definition. Um, that there are causes that prompt someone to create a rhetorical text. Um, but maybe I don't know if more common is the word, but at least the shortcut definition that I use in my head to think about what exigence means, or what we mean when we talk about exigence, is the need. a need for a rhetorical response. What is the need for something to happen? Why did this need to be made? Why did the creator, the communicator, the author, the speaker, whoever, why did they feel the need to create this? What was that need? So I'm going to talk about this in terms of social media because I'm hoping this will make sense for you, maybe, because I think it's one of an easy area to think about exigence, maybe, and especially about kairos, about the term kairos. So if you remember in your book, they talked about how kairos was a Greek god. He was the Greek god of the fleeting moment, um, and that's an idea that's wrapped up in exigence. That this is something that needs to be talked about right now, right? This is an issue of the moment. This text needs to be created at this time because if you wait too long, that need's going to go away. There's the moment will have passed for this text. And I feel this kairos in social media posting. So my social media posting is probably different than your experience of social media posting, simply because, I'm older, I'm married, I have kids, I've got a different social circle than you. But hopefully you can still sort of relate to this experience. So these are both pictures from last year, but I'll explain. So this first one, right? So around August, September, my Instagram feed starts filling up with all the pictures of all of my friends who are sending their kids off to school because, many of my friends have age children just like I do. So my feed fills up with these pictures of kids with holding their signs, all about the first day of school. Um, and I start feeling this need. Oh, I need to take a picture of my child standing in front of our front door holding a sign on their first day of school. I need to create this thing too, and I need to post it because everyone else is doing it. So I feel that need, I feel that pressure, I feel that exigence. And I take that picture and I post it on the first day of school, and talk all about my kids going off to school and we're so excited and yada yada yada. Now, I wouldn't post this picture in January because there's no need to post the picture in January, right? Like the need has passed, the moment has passed. Like even a week later, it feels like the moment has passed. And you see it, right? You see those people who are always posting throwback pictures or this happened a few weeks ago, I'm trying to catch up or whatever. And don't they all feel a little bit like, the moment's passed. The need has passed for you to post that picture. If you wait long enough, you don't need to post that picture anymore. Um, Same with this was from last October, this one over here. My children at a pumpkin patch. Once again, come October, my feed is chock full of people's children in Halloween costumes at pumpkin patches, doing all sorts of those fall things. And so, we have those experiences. I feel the need to take a picture of my children there and to post it to social media too. But again, I'm not going to post this picture in July, right? Um, the timing has passed. The moment is gone. There is no need to create this post in July with a picture that's, 7 months out of date or even longer than that, right? Like half a year out of date. Um, okay, so I hope that helped you understand exigence. And maybe social media is sort of a flippant example of feeling that need. There are obviously much bigger ones, much more serious, especially when we're talking at the level of social politics, big things going on in the world. For instance, right now, let's say there's lots of text being produced about everyone wear a mask. Pandemic is happening right now. Will there always be a need to talk about people wearing masks? Goodness, we sure hope not, right? Like, we hope that a year from now, that's not something that we're still talking about, that the need for this message has passed. Um, but there are other issues, I'll just point this out, that other issues that are, say, evergreen, or at least are trying to be evergreen, are always trying to be relevant. Um, and they try to sustain their kairos. So when you're writing your papers, I definitely want you to be thinking about exigence, right? What's your need for communicating the way you're communicating? What's the need for you posting whatever it is you're posting. Is Kairos playing a role, right? Is this in the moment? Or is there a sustained contextual need for this sort of communication? Um, why are you communicating this particular thing at this particular moment? All right. All right, let's talk about medium now. So in a shortened, simple version, medium is the technical format a text is presented in. So print paper or computer screen or video, or I have a podcast here, or a billboard. Um, these are the mediums. And they can be important to talk about because they can influence how a purpose is achieved or what audience can be reached. So, for instance, this is my example here. I'm choosing to film this lecture and do it as a video, present it to you as a video, instead of just typing up the notes and making you read it, because I'm assuming that the medium of a video is going to be more appealing to most of you as an audience um, than reading a long document would be. So I have chosen my medium of video here to communicate these messages in the hopes that it's more appealing to you as an audience and more entertaining or more something, right? More interesting. Um, Now, medium is closely related to modality, but there are some differences. Modality has to do with senses, with the senses giving and receiving information. So, for instance, there's like a verbal modality, visual modality, an aural hearing modality. Um, there's spatial or haptic modality, and then the one I like to throw in there or talk about too is the gestural modality, body language, essentially. So there's ways to communicate verbally, ways to communicate with visual information, ways to communicate with spatial information or, like, yeah, the haptic information, and ways to communicate with body language. So, right, it's about communicating with and to senses. So you can see how this is related to media, right? Um, so, for instance, one of the reasons that I chose to do the video medium is because because you can receive this in multiple modalities. I can use multiple modalities in a video, right? If you were only reading this text, that would only be a visual linguistic modality. You're just straight reading a text. But if you're watching this video, you can hear my voice, you can see my facial gestures, my body language. You have these nice images that I found on the internet to look at. So the video is multimodal, which is hopefully more interesting. Something I'm thinking about and trying to appeal to my audience is making it slightly more interesting. So you can see how all of these things and choices might impact how a message is communicated, right? So when it comes to your self-presentation, genres, your essays on self-presentation, I want you to think about the mediums and the modes that you're using and if there's anything interesting about them that influences how your message gets shared, gets put across. Um, for instance, are you typing up words to share in a social media post, or are you just going to put a visual image there? That's a choice of mode, right? Um, and why do you make those choices? All right. Whew, let's talk about genre now. Now, if you've already taken your quiz, you'll remember that the way your book defines genre might sound a little bit strange or baffling or different. This is how your book defines it. Somewhat stabilized yet flexible forms of communication that have developed over time and in response to other rhetorical factors. Right? Like, what does that even mean? So I just want you to know that genre is like it's like this huge area of study in the field of rhetoric, and lots of deep thinking has gone into this definition of genre. There's a whole history of really deep um, theoretical scholarly debate about what genre is and how they've defined it here. So yes, the definition that your book gives sort of reflects that this really deep field of scholarly work that has gone into genre. But if the way that you typically understand genre is, what I have here on the screen, um, as sort of like, categories of movies, categories of books, types of books, science fiction, fantasy, romance, yada yada. You're still right. Those are still types of genres. And those types of genres still have bearing on rhetoric. So this is the easier way for you to think about it. That's fine. The big idea that I want you to take away from this definition, the idea that I want you to have about genre is that we have this tendency as humans to categorize things. Genre is all about putting things into categories. So when it comes to texts, right, um, rhetorical texts, we put them into these categories called genres. And that influences the way an audience might receive a text or the way you might be communicating to your audience. And it can influence it, I think, in two different ways. So for one, if you are proclaiming a certain genre, like I'm writing a letter to the editor, well, there's certain features that are going to be expected in that genre, um, and your audience is going to expect those features. And if you don't give them those certain features that are generally expected in that genre, then the first response could be um, failure to communicate. Your audience could dismiss you as not, well, you don't know what you're saying, you don't know how to write in this genre. Um, so that could derail your communication. Sometimes it can be really good, though, if you do something interesting or exciting or innovating in the genre that your audience isn't expecting, right? That can be good. That can be, oh, this is exciting. This is something new that we haven't seen before, something we weren't expecting. So it can cut both ways, right? Um, Paying attention to genre can be boring, typical, staying in convention, or it can be exciting or interesting if you're sort of playing around with conventions. But you have to be careful about how you do it. So when it comes to your genre of self-presentation, right, your category of self-presentation, you need to be thinking about how genre influences your rhetoric. So like say that you're talking about your clothes and how your clothes present you to the world. Do you dress in a very conventional way that fits expectations of a certain genre of fashion? Um, or do you try to bend rules a little bit, be unexpected in fashion choices because you're hoping your audience will appreciate that? Or are you bending rules and is it failing miserably in fashion choices? Does this make sense how this idea of genre might apply to your essay? I hope so. Okay. Our last term, finally, last term that we're going to be talking about this week is circulation. This is related to many other things, but the general idea is how does your rhetorical text get to its intended audience, right? It's very easy to think about in terms of social media. You post, and those people who follow you see it, right? That is basic social media circulation. But then it might get a little bit more complicated because then your post might get shared and reshared, and suddenly you have a much wider circulation than you anticipated. Maybe you even go viral. Has anyone had that experience? Because I certainly haven't. But that is a form of circulation, going viral, just getting shared and shared and shared. Um, so that's modern digital age circulation. There is also still, of course, old school circulation. We've got our newsboy here, physically passing out rhetorical materials, making sure that physical objects get into the hands of people, or at least physically seen by people. All of that is part of circulation. So in thinking about your genre of self-presentation, think about how does your message get shared? How does it get communicated to your audience? What's the circulation of it? Woo, okay, so that's all the terms that we're covering this week, or in this unit. Now, do you need to use every single one of these terms in your essay? Oh, heavens no. You only have 750 words, so if you talked about every single one of these terms, your paper would be terribly boring. It would be awful. So what I recommend is that you think through these terms carefully and choose the ones that are the most interesting to focus on. For your particular genre, your particular rhetorical objects that you're talking about, and only maybe bring in a few of these terms. Um, Make sure that you do bring in a few terms, though. That's the idea. You are trying to demonstrate your knowledge, um, your 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 initial knowledge of what rhetoric is and how to use this terminology. But no, you don't need to use every single one of these terms. So I hope that was helpful. Remember to hang on to your term sheet. We will need it in Unit 2, and you will be um, turning it in then, and we'll finish it off then. All right. Okay.